Let's answer the question right up front, and then we will do some unpacking, explain why we came to this conclusion. Okay, the question is this. Is Asperger's syndrome curable? Is there a cure for Asperger's syndrome? The answer is no. Based upon what? Well, number one, based upon life's laboratory. By that I mean I'm approaching 70 years old. 7 decades I've lived with Asperger's syndrome, during which time I have learned a thing or two and I've made some observations, and I'd like to pass those on to you no matter how old you are. Well, besides life's laboratory, there has also been research done that concludes much the same. For example, we take a look at the National Institutes for Health. From them, we learned this. The cause of Asperger's syndrome, like most ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is what that acronym stands for. Though not fully understood, but there is a strong genetic basis, which means it does tend to run in families. It's genetic. You can't change your genes. All right, you can have plastic surgery, but your genes remain the same. Now, again, we're going to unpack and explain how this works in just a second. But we also have twin studies. This comes to us from ioncommunity.org. In here we read in one identical twin, if one identical twin has autism spectrum disorder, the other twin has a 76% chance of also being diagnosed with it. However, that is not true of fraternal twins. A fraternal twin has a much less chance of being autistic or having Asperger's syndrome. That points to a genetic cause. Now, I know there's some other explanations out there. For example, exposure during pregnancy, during your natal life, to prenatal life to testosterone may be a cause for Asperger's syndrome. But still, you would have the genetic component that makes you vulnerable to that, so it still points back to nature rather than nurture. Not to say that nurture doesn't influence it somewhat, but ultimately it is genetically, you are predispositioned genetically to have Asperger's syndrome. If you have it, and because of that, once you've got it, you can't get rid of it. Okay, why would you even want to? Now, again, this is my opinion. But I don't see Asperger's syndrome as a disease. It's not an illness, so you can't cure it. If it's not a disease, not an illness, what's to cure? In addition to that, it's Asperger's syndrome has many beneficial components. So if it's not an illness, if it's not a disease, if it's often beneficial, why would you even want to cure it? That doesn't make any sense to me. All right, let's unpack some of this. Dig in a little bit deeper, but let's think of it in these terms. How fast can you run? I can run maybe 15 miles per hour. That, by the way, is kind of slow, but I can run as fast as I want. I've got free will. If I want to go out and run right now, I can take off running and I can run as fast as I want. Within a limit. There's a boundary. That boundary for me is kind of slow. It's 15 miles per hour. Other people, they have a different boundary. Some people can run much faster than that. Well, there are other, what I call life's boundaries, limitations. For example, I can talk as loud as I want to. Up to a point. There are decibel boundaries. I can't talk as loud as, say, a firework display, the sound of a firework display, or a sonic boom. I can't talk that loud, but still, I can talk as loud as I want within the bounds of my genetic predisposition. Same thing is true of you. And we could go on. There are a lot of examples of this, but the point is, everybody has genetic boundaries. And what is true of running and talking is also true of our minds. Think of the smartest person that you know of that has ever lived. Most people would say Albert Einstein, but he's not the smartest person who's ever lived, but he was very smart. They say he had an IQ that peaked around 100, 160. That's a very smart man, but that was his limit. That was his boundary. 160, maybe a little bit higher. Can you improve your IQ? Well, a little bit. But like running, you can train yourself to go faster, but ultimately nobody can run a mile in 1 minute. 4 minutes, a lot of people do that. 1 minute. No, we're all set to boundaries. All right, same thing is true of Stephen Hawking. He had an IQ, they say, of about 160. Very, very intelligent people. Well, what is the ultimate boundary for the human race? I mean, there's what, over 7.5 billion of us? How smart is the smartest person who has ever lived? Well, from research I've done, the very peak of IQ is around 300. There has never been a person with an IQ of 400. So we are all locked into this boundary, a limitation. The reason we say that is to understand that Asperger's syndrome, autism, has boundaries, and we live within those boundaries. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a negative. It's not a positive. Just a matter of fact. Now, having said all that, let me say this. I do not intend to turn this into a Sunday school lesson. So if you are not a religious person, please don't get upset with me when I make references to the Bible, but there is a lot of excellent philosophy contained in the Bible. Observations that we should not disregard just because we have an aversion to religion or the supernatural. The reason I bring that up is the Bible does make reference to our boundaries or our limitations. For example, Luke 12:25 says that we have boundaries of our habitation. Now, most people think that refers to geographical boundaries. People live in particular areas, and you can only travel so far, which made perfect sense back in the first century when this was written, but still it applies genetically. And the Bible goes on in a different place and it says, hey, you can think about it all you want, but genetically, I'm obviously paraphrasing, the Bible doesn't say this verbatim, but genetically you can only be so tall. You can think about it and say, I'd like to be 9 feet tall and I'm going to focus on this until I grow. Sorry, that's not going to work. Why? Because you have genetic boundaries. And again, application. If you have Asperger's syndrome, don't consider that a negative. Just understand that you're living within your boundaries. I call those intrinsic boundaries because they're genetic, but there's also extrinsic boundaries. For example, boundaries of our habitation would include oxygen. How long can you live without oxygen? I don't know, but I'm guessing it's not very long. So if we want to go to outer space, get on a space shuttle, got to take oxygen with us. You want to go underwater? Hold your breath. Or maybe take an oxygen tank. Take oxygen with you, or maybe get in a submarine. Why? Because, and I know maybe I'm talking too much about this, but we have limitations. We have biological, genetic limitations, and nothing we can do about it. We just live within those boundaries. We live within those limitations. Well, let's think of psychological traits. Not just IQ, but other intrinsic psychological traits. Got to say this up front. I'm not comparing psychopathy with autism. They're totally different things. But still, people with psychopathy, psychopaths, have boundaries. Once a psychopath, always a psychopath. We call these people evil when all they're doing is just responding to their genetic programming. So we put them in prison. Well, they killed somebody. Maybe their serial killers killed a lot of people. But what if, and yeah, I think there is a place for incarceration, not only for their own protection, but to protect the rest of us. But let's understand when we recognize the people have boundaries, we have psychological limitations, then there can be intervention. And we can save people's lives. And again, I'm not comparing autism or Asperger's syndrome to psychopathy. I'm just saying that psychological predispositions sometimes can't be changed. They can be treated to a degree, and there can be some intervention. Plastic surgery, if you want to make some changes, cosmetic changes, but genetic, still there. Autism, genetic, it's still there. You can make changes within the boundaries. You've got free will within the boundaries. Outside the boundaries, can't go there. Just like you cannot go without oxygen. Now, we refer to psychopaths as evil. I don't think that's useful because it doesn't help us address some very serious problems with psychopathy. By the same token, I think it's very cruel, evil, when we punish a child who has learning disorders because we think that child is just lazy. It's just downright mean. Well, actually, it's uneducated. It's the outgrowth of ignorance, but once we are informed, then there's no excuse for it. Same thing with people with autism or Asperger's syndrome. There may be an accompanying learning disability. So we say, those people are lazy. Not necessarily. They could be lazy, but usually that's not the case. What about eye contact? Some people say, that guy is arrogant, narcissistic, doesn't make eye contact. He's a loner, he's a lone wolf. And we have all these pejoratives the people level against us when all we're doing is just operating within our limitations, within our boundaries. And if we could go outside those boundaries, probably we would. I mean, people with Asperger's syndrome, as you know, often have a very difficult time holding down a job because they have sociological impairments. But if we recognize they're just operating within their limitations, they have a free will, but it only goes so far, then we understand, they're not lazy, they're not antisocial, they're not arrogant, they just have traits, natural traits, and sometimes those traits can be very, very positive. For example, you hire a person with Asperger's syndrome, they tend to be, honest to a fault, if that's even possible. They tend to be very loyal employees. They tend to be very focused. They can do a job well. I mean, it's like the ideal employee. They show up on time. They're very organized. Again, Asperger's syndrome has a lot of positive traits, and as an employer, we need to recognize those and understand just because this person doesn't make eye contact or is socially awkward doesn't make that a bad person. They're just operating within their limitations, within their traits. They got free will, but up to a point, they can only run so fast. So if you can't run a 4-minute mile, does that make you a bad person? Don't think so. If you have difficulty making eye contact, does that make you a bad person? I don't think so. It just means, again, you have boundaries of your habitation. As a person with Asperger's syndrome, we have boundaries of our habitation. We have limits. We operate within those boundaries. And when we recognize that, we understand, hey, I'm okay. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. We all have our boundaries. We all have intrinsic and extrinsic boundaries. Some people can lift heavier weights than other people. Does that make them better? No, it just makes them different. I don't know anybody who can curl a ton. So we all have limitations. Does that make anybody a bad person because they can't bench press a Volkswagen? No, just means you're operating within the boundaries of your limitations.